Good morning, everybody. We're very glad to not see you and to see you this morning for this online conference. We would, of course, have wanted it to take place in a physical space, and that is not going to happen anytime soon. And so this is not our second best. It's a great option, which we're trying to make the best use of. We're very happy to host this meeting this morning with WRR, our colleagues and friends in the Netherlands. The occasion for the meeting is the work the WRR has completed is preparing on digital disruption. We have all seen during the last year or so that this is becoming an absolutely critical issue for most countries in the world, and particularly for us in Europe. And the seminar this morning is going to try and address how this is impacting daily life and also raising the stakes in a number of areas. We will be having a sequence of presentations. We hope to leave sufficient room for debates. We have time for questions and answers. We are approaching this with a view that to properly understand what is happening in the world now, you have to be multidisciplinary, and you also have to have points of views coming from different countries. And although we share a wide range of issues and views with WRR, we also are aware of the fact that our two countries are different, and that it's very enlightening to see how the other is doing and addressing specific issues, and that we can learn a lot one from another, particularly in this time of acute crisis. Maybe just a few comments on what we're going through at present. We all know the world is experiencing a crisis that has absolutely no precedent. It is really changing our daily lives in a way that had been completely unanticipated. But it's also changing the way we relate to one another, the way we work, the way we shop, the way we consult doctors. And those are areas where we have seen very rapid transformations. I'll come back to that in a second. It is striking that governments the world over have been taking roughly similar decisions, giving priority to healthcare and saving lives over economic activity. And this results in something which mankind had never experienced, which is a man-made, policy-made crisis, economic crisis of huge proportions. I want to insist on this because we all know it, but it has major consequences on the way the crisis is evolving, particularly because usually, we can say so, when we have an economic crisis, the roots of the crisis are economic. And if you want to fix the crisis, you have to try and understand what went wrong in the economy. This is not what we're experiencing today. What we are experiencing today is a health crisis resulting in decisions, resulting in an economic crisis. And to fix it, we of course have to fix or address the health issues. And then we have to work on what policies will be able to adjust to the new environment, which will solve new problems that were not pre-existing to the crisis, and that will result in an economy that in some areas will have changed, and in other areas, many areas, will not have changed this much. So a completely unprecedented challenge for policymakers. We also have experienced a medical revolution. It has never happened before in mankind's history that vaccines were created so rapidly, that they were tested, and that they're now in the process of being industrialized at such a rapid pace. And this is, of course, one of the major takeaways of the situation. And different countries have had different approaches to that, but globally, we've had an extraordinary feat in the medical order. In the digital sphere, we haven't experienced a technological revolution. What we have seen is massive use of pre-existing technologies that were not being used on the scale they're being used today. And this extraordinary growth of the use of a number of existing techniques has major consequences, of which I would want to signal a few. The key message is that the increased use of techniques that rely on digital technology has changed the nature of the issues at stake, and not only the size of the players in those games. It has been globally unbelievably successful, but it is creating new challenges. Let me focus on some of these challenges. Teleworking. Before the crisis, it was viewed as, a nice to have thing. It was a comfort given to workers who had possibly to travel long distances daily and who had long and difficult commuting constraints. It was viewed as something which prosperous economies could afford to do. It has now been viewed in a completely different approach, of course, which is the way to address the healthcare concerns, to avoid people using crowded collective transport means. And this is, of course, a very different norm. We now know that what we're looking at is new managerial issues, new compensation issues, and it's, of course, a challenge for providers of internet access, where bandwidth issues have been very substantial, but they have been solved. It has been an extraordinary opportunity for those companies that offer video conferencing services. We're an example of that today. You all have seen the phenomenal growth of Zoom, and its market cap has been multiplied a number of times. And this has been the case for many offerings in the video conferencing industry. So the solutions existed, but they've been scaled up at an unprecedented speed, and they've changed our daily working lives to an extent which we would never have imagined. It has been now commonplace in conversations with colleagues to discuss about how to handle video conferencing meetings, how to address the particular stress you have from days online, where because you lack the normal signals you perceive when you're in the same room, you have to compensate with attention, and it creates tension in this particular sort of fatigue at the end of the day. All this has been now part of our daily lives. A second area I would want to make a few comments on is distance learning. Various countries have taken very different routes as to opening schools, opening colleges, universities, or having part-time online, part-time at school. But in all cases, what we've seen is that a world that was not viewed as apt to very rapid change has adapted at an extraordinary speed. We in France have often a view that change in the world of education is slow, painstaking, that it has to be negotiated during years and years with social partners who are globally reluctant to change and who are very diffident of any change. What we have seen there is not 100% success, but let's say 95% success, which is enormous, and a very, very rapid adaptation to new circumstances where teachers who had before that only known having a physical class in a physical room were able to take their phones, to send email messages, to use text messages, and in some cases to use specific software to keep a link with their pupils or with the families of their pupils too. This has been a change of a magnitude that I really think no one had anticipated. It has created a lot of difficulties. We are aware that not everyone has the same access to technologies. It is likely that in many cases it will have worsened pre-existing inequalities. It has also, in some cases, solved issues which were not solved before. But the balance is very likely to be that, at least in the initial phases, it will have increased inequalities, and that the use of the new solutions hasn't been completely fairly distributed. A few comments on shopping. Online shopping was growing since decades, and particularly in the last decade. In the last year, it has probably made as much progress as in the previous decade. That has tremendous consequences. It has consequences on delivery services, on logistics, on data accumulation, on the balance of power between the big players and the small players. It is bringing radical changes. And it is something which we are only beginning to perceive the reach of. Click and collect is growing, and that may be a partial solution for small shops, but the bulk of the consequence has been reinforcing the dominance of pre-existing dominant players, Amazon, of course, and the other key players of that industry. It is also changing substantially the way we shop in daily life, the way we drive to the mall or to the market, the way we walk there. All that is changing a lot. Another area which I would want to signal is telemedicine, of course. The techniques were available since years and years. And in a country like France, there were tremendous obstacles to the use of telemedicine. The institutions were reluctant. The doctors were skeptical. And as a result, although it was available, it was not used. It has grown over the last year at a pace that had no precedent to. And it is, of course, generating new issues. Is this a solution for distant locations where a doctor isn't available? Is it changing the way doctors relate to their patients? And what happens with data gathering in the framework of telemedicine? And will new actors emerge because of these rapid mutations? All these questions are open today. And I think we have to be aware that they are, and we will be coming back to that later, the source of considerable new questions on competition law, on data protection, on cybersecurity. And this will be a number of the topics we'll be addressing later this morning. And we will be coming back to that in the concluding remarks. Both WRR and Stratégie are institutions that aim at contributing to policy making and to public good by publishing rigorous analysis, trying to anticipate what is going to happen. I think what we're going to do this morning is completely consistent with this mission of ours. And I hope you will be enjoying the debates which we will be having. And I would now want to give the floor to Corinne, who has also some remarks before we go to other presentations.
Thank you, Gilles. Thank you for your introduction, elaborate introduction. And also on behalf of the WRR, welcome to you all as participants from both France and the Netherlands. And thank you in advance to our colleagues from Stratégie for co-organizing this meeting. We've done so in the past, for example, in Brussels on the middle class and the crisis in the middle class, but this is the first, Gilles, that we do online. So thank you for offering the platform and the facilities. Ladies and gentlemen, first slide, please. The Scientific Council for Government Policy in the Netherlands published a report 1.5 years ago on digital disruption. And in particular, in the present COVID-19 time, thinking about digital disruption is crucial. I have prepared a few slides, more elaborate slides than I can address in the 15 minutes that are located for me in the program. But the slides are to be sent to you afterwards, and that's the reason why they are a bit more elaborate. Also, our report has been translated in English and will become available at Springer in an open access publication. So you can have the publication in open access, I think in a couple of months. And we'll inform you on that through France Stratégie, I presume. That will be possible. So let me turn to the presentation. Next slide, please. As Gilles has already indicated, for various reasons, it is crucial, it is important to think about digital disruption. First, for the very fact that we've become much more dependent on digital means. Gilles addressed online education, teleworking, work from home, the use of telemedicine. In addition to that, we do see much more use of digital technologies in addressing the crisis itself, apps on your phone for tracking and tracing, the use of artificial intelligence for detecting and looking for patterns in the treatment, as well as potential patterns in the vaccination. So we're very much dependent on digital means during this crisis. That's the first reason why we need to think about digital disruption and why the report of the WRR could be of relevance here. The second reason is that we note that actors addressing the crisis are a lucrative point of attack for hackers. You've all seen the attacks on Pfizer, on the World Health Organization, on the European Medicine Authority, and in our respective countries, both in France as well as in the Netherlands, hospitals were victim or potential victim of attacks. My colleagues from France Stratégie informed me that just when the crisis hit last year in March, one of your hospitals in Paris was under attack, successfully under attack by hackers. And unfortunately, the damage was not that huge. But next slide, please. What if, for example, WannaCry, a major attack that happened 3 years ago, would have happened last year, May. So 3 years later, May 12th. As I think the majority of you knows, WannaCry had a huge impact in many countries around the world. Among others, in the UK. The UK National Health Service hospitals were a clear victim of WannaCry. Up to 70,000 devices were affected. Among them, not only the computers, but also scanners, refrigerators for keeping up the temperature, the medicine. So imagine what if WannaCry hit 3 years later. Or another example, in the Netherlands, we specifically had to deal 2 months prior to the present crisis with Citrix. Citrix is a facility, a software program for remote access. So a huge number of organizations depend in the Netherlands on Citrix applications, even now, also now, meaning not only that people could not work from home, but also that patients could not access their files in hospitals. So remote access, remote working was at that point in time in the Netherlands, given the high dependency on the Citrix software, problematic. So what if Citrix hit during the crisis? Next slide, please. So just for you to cite one of the news clippings and briefings on the effects of WannaCry at the National Health Service in the UK. not rehearsed for a national cyber attack, not immediately clear who should lead the response, and the disaster recovery plan did not account for a cyber attack. The disaster recovery plan of the hospital addressed what to do with the patients in the case of an emergency, but not what to do with patients in the case of a digital emergency. So next slide. At the WRR, we started with our report some 3-4 years ago, posing the question, of course, we all prepare for cybersecurity, but if we look at cybersecurity, it's very much focused at prevention, instead of recognizing that 100% security does not exist. So the chance that something will go wrong and that we are a victim of an attack is highly likely. So what if the digital world is on fire? Who to call? And what is the fire extinguisher in digital terms? During our research, when we posed these questions, no clear answers were given. So that made us draw up the report that I would briefly like to discuss with you. Before turning to the next slide, what characterizes a digital fire? So what characterizes a digital fire is chains and networks, high interdependence of actors, 1. 2, multiple parties. Multiple parties also in a combination of the public and the private sector. As I will discuss later on, government organizations highly depend on private partners, private companies in their software, clouds, etc. services, meaning that when something goes wrong, they highly depend on the action of a private partner. And a final characteristic of the digital fire is the geopolitical dimension. More and more, this is an issue with geopolitical dimensions. It is a very lucrative and attractive point of attack for certain countries in the world. Next slide, please. So how do we at the WRR define digital disruption? Digital disruption, in our understanding, is disruption or breakdown of a digital system, which can be both intentional as well as unintentional, an error in an update. It is about breakdown, disruption. But what we find very important is that digital disruption should be regarded as a form of societal disruption. It is no longer an ICT thing. It should no longer be an ICT thing, because there is a strong interaction between the digital world and the physical world. Payments, healthcare, I've mentioned a few sectors there where you clearly see the interdependence between the digital world and the physical world. So how do we define digital disruption? It is a digital breakdown or interruption, but given its effect, it has to be seen as a societal disruption in its essence and in its implications, and thus in its measures. Next slide, please. So as mentioned, COVID-19 clearly shows us the intertwining of the digital and the physical world. Work, healthcare, we already touched upon that. First recommendation in our report is that we should broaden the perspective beyond cyber and beyond those responsible for ICT. This should be what is sometimes called a boardroom issue. This should be high up in the agenda of organizations and private companies, and not merely being seen as an ICT thing, but as a threat that has broader consequences, as said, the broader societal consequences. So our first recommendation in the report is broaden the scope, broaden the discussion, and see the interaction between online and offline. Recognize that interaction. Next slide, please. Second, as said, chains, networks, connections are a characteristic of digital facilities and digital tools. What we noted during our research is that too much emphasis is on individual organizations. For example, in preparing for a digital disaster, organizations prepare for themselves within their isolated setting. But when we pose the question, do you have a clear picture of the private companies as well as public organizations with whom you link in a chain? Do you have a clear view on the interdependencies? From what company do you depend online? For example, with what cloud provider do you have a contract to facilitate your data storage? And do you know from each other as companies and organizations with what private partners and what private actors you relate in that sense? The answer was often we do not know. We do not have the full picture. So another recommendation in our report is map interdependencies. Be aware of the interdependencies and have a clear overview of your interdependencies with other actors. That also brings me to another point that we make in the report, critical and non-critical processes and infrastructures. In France, as well as in the Netherlands, we have specific policy measures directed at the critical infrastructure. And I was informed by France Stratégie that last year, there were 200 attacks on the vital infrastructure. Cyber attacks on the vital infrastructures in France. But if you take a careful look at the actors that are involved in attacks on critical infrastructure, it could be that very far down the chain, there is one small company where, as a domino effect, the cyber attack, the disruption starts. And ultimately has an effect in the vital infrastructure, in the vital processes. So a recommendation that we make is pay attention to chains and network that support the critical processes and the critical infrastructure. Do not regard it as an isolated infrastructure and as an isolated vital process, but see the broader and look at the broader perspective. Next slide, please. So interdependencies. Continuity of public services and society is partly in the hands of non-domestic private partners. Cloud services are provided by a handful of mostly US companies. We in Europe highly depend on just a few US companies as regards our cloud services. What if something goes wrong? Another discussion is on interdependencies with Huawei and China, so the geopolitical aspect of this point. So our recommendation here is think upfront, more strategically about the desired level of dependence on non-domestic private parties. And of course, this also relates to the international dimension and the international chain and cause of effect, but also international cooperation. So intensify international cooperation, and that's also why we are highly pleased with today's conference, because we share, as France and the Netherlands, a mutual interest to cooperate at a European level. And at the final stage of our program, we will turn to European cooperation. So international cooperation is crucial, but at the same time, we recognize in our report that there is something to be done at a national level as well. So it is not only international cooperation, it is also action at a national level. And that brings me to the final part of my presentation. We formulate our recommendations along 4 phases, well-known phases in crisis dealings: preparedness, detecting threats, response, recovery. And for all those phases, we've thought through in our report what to do given a cyber disaster with huge societal impact. Preparedness, detection, response, recovery all require a mutual effort of relevant actors, both in the private sector as well as in the public sector, national and international. But there is a specific responsibility for the government, and I will turn to that later. Important also is start now. I mean, we see it with the current crisis. What if we would have prepared for the COVID-19 in an earlier phase? So an important message in our report is now we have the time to prepare for relevant measures to be prepared. So do not wait for the attack itself, because then it becomes too much ad hoc and too much on the bluff. And as said, at all phases, both international as well as national actions. Next slide, please. So I'll briefly turn to the 4 phases. And I've listed there a few of the measures. I'm not going to discuss all of them. I've listed a few of the measures that we've discussed in more detail in our report. Preparedness. Think about fallback options. Think about how to respond to the emergency by providing other actors with your information. What information do you want to share, and what information do you want to keep for yourself for a certain period? In its reaction, the Dutch cabinet has indicated, also with a very recent letter of February 3rd, that it intends to do more research in what information can be shared and what information cannot be shared outside, for example, the vital sector, with parties outside the vital sector. So preparedness has to deal with different measures, but also detecting threats, working together to get a better insight. Interdependencies, I already referred that, but also more strategic thinking about foreign investment and takeovers. Next slide, please. Phases of response and phases of recovery. Response. Perhaps as by way of illustration, we had a major attack, at least we suffered in the Netherlands from an attack at the Rotterdam harbor with Maersk. Maersk went down with all the trucks and the lorries and the ships coming in. The City Council of Rotterdam wanted to know what was happening, wanted to have more details about the potential effects of this attack, and sent a firefighter, so-called, one could say a firefighter, to the Rotterdam haven. The person was not allowed access. Well, suppose a firefighter is not being given access when your house is on fire. So what we put on the agenda in our report is discuss and look at whether you have sufficient powers to intervene, to actually, as a firefighter, intervene in a digital disruption and look at what is happening. Avoid improvisation there. And finally, the last stage, recovery, make better use of incident data. Think about insurance. Facilitate insurance companies with potentially a fund, because recovery means learning lessons. Recovery means also starting over again, for which financial means are in order. So we do see, at least in the Netherlands, a rather fragmented landscape when it comes to incident data registration. And while we do think that much more can be learned there when combining the data at the different authorities and as said, learning from that. Gilles, this was my presentation for this moment. I'm sure that many of the issues can be discussed, but in the 15 minutes, these are the points that I would like to bring in first to the floor as a start for our program and later on our discussion. Thank you.
Thank you, Corinne. That was great. And we'll be giving the floor to Anne Faure and Eric Chavez in a second. Just a comment on what you've said about digital disruption. the stakes have risen enormously with the crisis because digital was already pervasive, but it's now everywhere, in shopping, in working, in even our daily relations with one another. And I think when we look at how rapidly practices and way habits have changed in the last year, we have to be aware that it comes with a substantially increased danger of digital disruption. And I think we've heard loud and clear your messages on that. I think we should all be aware of the fact that because we're increasingly dependent on interconnected digital systems, the dangers and the risks associated with digital disruption have substantially increased. Now, Anne and Eric, the floor is yours.
Yeah, thank you, Gilles, and thank you, Corinne, for giving me the floor. I will just have just technical information to say for the audience. You can put your reaction or question to the speaker and the chat, please, and we will have a question and answer sequences just after the intervention of Eric. So please do it for our lively session. It's a very good thing. Yeah, I will be. I will just have some illustration of what Gilles and Corinne say. How the crisis, what the crisis shows us is shows to what extent the digital services and digital technology have facilitated the social and the life during the crisis, the lockdown, but show us also to what extent we are dependent on it, and how the risks and cyber disruption are much more important than before. So we choose to have three type of illustration what's happened here in France. One about the question of infrastructure, the second about telework, and healthcare services, access to healthcare services. The first thing is during the crisis, the use of the network and the traffic on the internet has incredibly increased. For the OECD, the increase of the traffic in internet and at the world level was 60%. In France, 30% traffic of increase, the traffic of internet increase of 30%, according to a French telecom regulator. And the first question for us was, for the telco company was, what will happen if the entire internet crash or shut down? It didn't happen. The internet held up, but it was a real first question at the beginning of the containment of the lockdown. The European Commission and the BEREC, the Association of European Telecom Regulator, made a joint statement to encouraging providers, content or application providers, to temporarily adapt the speed of video streaming to reduce the data consumption and the data, the broadcast used. The French regulator, ARCEP, made his own statement on his side and highlighted in particular that we have citizens and companies. We had to adapt use of the broadband, of the internet. And for example, that we have better to use fixed connection, because a connection fixed is specific to household. Instead, the mobile work and the mobile network is a common use. So it's more fragile. So we had to have to be more responsible in the way we use the network. So for me, it's perhaps the first lesson we learned from the crisis. resilience and recovery has also to be think from the infrastructure building and maintenance. The second issue and the second domain we want to speak is about telework. I just will illustrate some how it increased and what kind of problem we have to solve during the crisis and because of the problem of security. Thank you for the infographic. We have just resumed all the situation in France in the infographics. You can find it online on our website. As Gilles said, telework was a very limited practice in France, less than 10% workers. During the crisis, COVID, and still now, we have a massive use of teleworking. 5 million teleworkers during the first lockdown in France, according to the Ministry of Labour. And workers were quite happy and said that on the working population, 36% of the French working population said they can telework without difficulties. It was easy for them. But the lessons of the crisis is that many organizations, companies, private, public, were not prepared. They were not technically prepared, and the informations were not enough suitable for remote work. And the second question was more cultural, more social, because the management and the organization and they were not prepared to a remote management very large. So what we are in teleworking position, as you all know, the protection of the network and communication tools are very important, but they are also weaker. And so we exchange a lot of documents through platform and different new tools. We don't know really what are the security conditions exactly. And the French agency, Digital Security Agency, ANSSI, and also the DGSI, Direction Générale de Sécurité Intérieure. So different administration and in France have to alert of some threats. The first one that we already, everybody knows, it's about the utilization of Zoom, which was in the beginning a little problematic. But one of the another threat was also very important, particular for the small companies, and it's an attack called here fake president fraud. It's some things like a theft of identity, fraud with identity of the CEO and or high-level manager in company. And also what the ANSSI highlighted is that compared to the same period last year, there have been 19% more data leaks in the wilderness to date. So we have seen in a large scale of attacks and different attacks and the economic world that telework has increased. All we know is that if you are a large company, you have budget to spend to your security system, to secure your information system. But smaller companies often consider themselves less attractive for attacks. But this is a big mistake. According to a European-wide study by Insurance, Corinne, you speak about insurance, they calculate the economic impact of cyber attack against a company. They have established a median cost of this for attack, it's 50,000 euro. For a small company, it can be a very huge sum for the company. But for companies, the risks are not only financial, they are also legal. The CNIL, or Data Protection Regulator, has also make remind us, the CNIL, that a company that holds personal data, for example, is also legally responsible for the security of this data. And so if there is an infringement, the company can be sued for that. So this is also a risk about what we have to take in account now. So I will be very, very fast about what we also have as a social impact, as Corinne said, because digital risk is also societal risk and disruption. If telework is a really gain with much more flexibility, autonomy, it's a very good thing for company and worker. But what we have also noticed in France is that increase inequality among the workers in the same company, among the workers from people who are protected by teleworks and people who are not able to make telework, and so they are much more weaker economically, for example, because they can lose their job. So this is how we see also that there is also social impact about this digital increase and use. So my last example is about health sector. As Gilles said, we have an unprecedented increase of teleconsultation. Teleconsultation was very low in France for different reasons. As Gilles said, nobody wanted to go there. But we before the crisis in 2019, we had only 60,000 teleconsultation in France, taken charge by the health insurance. In 2020, we had 7,000 million annual access teleconsultation. So it's an unprecedented increase, and it shows that it was possible and that it is a possible response for continuity in care, and also, as Gilles said, a real asset for remote areas without health hospital or health facilities. Yes, we had, during the crisis, we had unfortunately been hit in French hospital by large attack. Karen says the example of the attack of Assistance des Hôpitaux de Paris, Assistance publique des Hôpitaux de Paris, which is a very huge establishment, and he had been attacked by a DDoS, distributed denial of service. It doesn't affect on critical infrastructure, but it was a large attack. Yesterday, we had a large attack on an hospital located in the southwest of France, in Dax. Very large attack. The director said that enjoyed to the people not coming to the hospital because the system was break down. So there is a real large issues about attack, risk, and recovery of healthcare facilities and information system. And I will just finish that the crisis give us also the lessons that about healthcare, there is a real question about truth and transparency around this question of digitalization. And it's also what Corinne said about social implication about digitalization and digital risks. The COVID crisis has revealed that the strategy challenge for France is have a good and better control of the health data. And as highlighted, a debate about the risk of we don't know, but risk of the health data hub. The health data hub is a data lake, special on medical data. And there is a large debate in France because this data hub is by the Microsoft, is hosted by Microsoft. And another illustration about the implication, interaction about social and digitalization is the application Stop COVID, which at the beginning, it was a debate in France about is the application really secure? Is the application really secure for our data and for our e-privacy? And the debate was, could public health issues may justify a temporary partial damage on our privacy or on our data, personal data? So that was a large panorama of the different questions about digitalization, usages and risks, what we have experienced in France.
Thank you, Anne. And now the floor is to Eric.
Thank you, Gilles, for a very nice and elaborate introduction, and Anne for interesting figures and facts from France and your view on it. Since Corinne highlighted already the main conclusions and recommendations of the report, I'd like to add three short comments to it. And they concern the relation between COVID-19 and digitization. So my first comment is that COVID-19 increased the developments that were already taking place in the use of digital means. So teleworking already was taking place. I checked some figures for myself. It used to be 37% people working from home. Now it's 48%. So it's on the rise. I completely agree with the image Gilles gave at the start of the meeting, that in healthcare people were reluctant to use telemedicine, and it's being used now much more. We see the same thing at primary schools, secondary schools. So digital means for teaching are being used on a much wider scale. But these developments were already taking place, and digital means are being used now on a much larger scale. So it's not something new, but it's on a larger scale, and it raises, of course, a lot of questions and problems that also have to deal with the socio-technical context, how to implement these means, and we all encounter different problems with it. But I'll just leave these two things and focus more on the cyber aspect of it. And that's my second point, that I think we encountered familiar questions about the security of these means, about the responsibility for these means. So if they fail, who's responsible? And about the ownership and control of these digital means. And for example, we talk a lot about attacks on hospitals these days, but in the Netherlands in 2018 and 2019, we had 10 large-scale incidents with hospitals, but by the way, unintended, with an unintended cause, just IT problems. So they were already there, and we could have prepared for incidents like these. Corinne mentioned the WannaCry incident hitting the NHS in the United Kingdom. We had incidents like the NotPetya, the Citrix, problems with working from home. So all these incidents raised questions that we could have been answering, and we were already busy with answering. But one of the characteristics of COVID-19, I think, is that on the one hand, it has become more urgent to answer these questions, to think about security, securing these digital means, and thinking about who should own these means. But on the other hand, it's much harder to address these questions and to solve these questions because the growing dependencies that we are confronted now, and there wasn't time to ask these questions partly, and there wasn't time to answer them. We just had to switch from the physical world to the digital world in just a few weeks, a few days even. So I think while these questions have become more urgent, it's harder to find solutions, because we kind of stumbled into the digital world during COVID-19 even more than we already did. So that's my second observation. So increasing developments that were already there, kind of meeting the same, encountering the familiar questions. So I don't think these are new, but it's harder to answer them. It's more urgent, and but it's harder to answer them. And my third point is, and I'm connecting here with the recommendations of the report, is of course, so what to do next in this new situation in which we have growing dependencies on all kinds of domains which weren't there a year ago. And I think that there's at least two things we need to do. And the first one is that we should rethink what critical infrastructure means in these days. So, and for those who don't know, critical infrastructures is the kind of policy label for the societal processes we can't do without. So it's payment services, it's electricity, it's for the Netherlands, it's dams and sluices. When I look at the window, I see meadows flooded. So it's important to manage the water. But it's also about digital facilities, for example, that are laid down in the Network and Information Directive. But Corinne mentioned two very important things that should be should be part of this process of rethinking what critical infrastructure means, because first of all, these physical and digital processes are really intertwined. So we still think about hospitals as buildings with patients and doctors in it. But hospitals are ICT organizations for years and years already. And they are connected. For example, in the Netherlands, there are two large providers of electronic patient registration systems. So if one of these two has problems, it's not just one hospital that's being hit, but it's several ones, and this gives a lot of problems. You can't send patients from the one to the other. So this is a whole new dynamic, and these two things, so ICT problems and, for example, patient safety, should be thought of in relation to each other. So, but my main point is here, we need a new map of what critical infrastructure means and how to move on in a digital world and how to secure it. And this map should include networks, it should include supply chains, it should include all kinds of organizations that are probably not yet on all these long lists of critical service providers. And so the new means of we use in education perhaps, or means of working from home perhaps. So all the landscape has changed, and it was already changing, but we need a new map. That's, I think, one of the things we should work on, a new map. And the second thing we need to do, I think, is we need also new ways of navigating in this world. And it's also, Corinne mentioned this too, we tend to think about securing critical infrastructure in terms of securing individual organizations, but we need to do much more, I think. And this is also, of course, open for discussion later on. But I think we should also think about standardization. So who's involved in developing the standards for all these digital means we're using? Because these standards are of great importance of how they function and how safe they are and how privacy sensitive they are. Another aspect is the design of these means. Who's in charge? Do we want to design these applications ourselves in the Netherlands or in Europe? Or do we want to sell them on a market for digital means? And if we want to design these things, a cloud, for example, what kind of capabilities do you need? Another aspect has to do with the operation. Corinne mentioned that a lot of these digital facilities are being operated and owned by private companies, and often companies abroad, often American companies or Chinese companies. That's something we should think about too. Do we want our schools to use platforms from what companies? Should it be private companies? Should it be public companies? Should it be something we develop ourselves? Should it be something we buy at the market? What kind of ownership structures do we prefer? And this is of great importance for the security of all these facilities, because when it goes down, you need someone to talk to, you need someone to restore it, because it's so vital for the functioning of society. So these are a few elements of a more strategic way of thinking about how to secure critical infrastructure beyond cybersecurity, and ways of navigating in a world, I think, that has become much more digitized during COVID-19. So let me wrap up. I think it has increased developments that were already taking place. I think we encountered a lot of familiar questions, but because of the increase, these questions have become much more urgent. But to address these questions, we need, well, new ways of thinking about what's critical for society and what these critical infrastructures actually look like. I don't think we have a proper view of this yet. We're working on it, but I don't think it's good enough. And a second one is that we need to navigate in new ways. We need to do much more than just having measures to secure these networks. We should also think about how to develop these networks, what standards these means should apply to questions about the design, about the development, and who's involved, and so on. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Eric. We will now go directly to the questions that have been coming from the room. And there is a first question which is directed to Corinne and including me, which is there any start in creating digital societal resilience at the European level? And who should be in charge? Corinne, I think this is very much in tune with your comments.
Yes, indeed. And I also give the floor to Eric because he's more up to date. But at a European level, we have, of course, a directive that provides for provisions on security levels, that also provides for provisions on security levels for critical infrastructure. One of the things that could be noted there is that it specifies various domains of critical infrastructure. But what we see over Europe in the different countries is that countries have implemented this directive and chosen their infrastructure in different manners. For example, healthcare is in the Netherlands not officially marked as vital infrastructure, whereas it is in France. So the healthcare domain there is within the broad scope of vital infrastructure, but not in the Netherlands. So Gilles, to answer this question, there is cooperation at a European level. There are legislative measures. Some of them are being updated. But what you do see is that at a national level, they are implemented in different manners, one. And two, when it comes to international cooperation, there is no true European firefighter. I mean, it's individual countries cooperating, but not as a joint force. Eric, would you like to add there?
Thank you, Corinne. Yes, so I think the harmonization is very important for the exchange of information, because the exchange of information is critical to prevent incidents from occurring. So we all know that. It's one of the best things we can do. Another thing is, and I think the Commission is busy with it, is rethinking what it just called what it means, critical infrastructure, because we have different categories at the moment. We have critical infrastructures, we have critical information infrastructures, essential services, digital service providers. So it would be a good thing to have these more uniform categories. But my point, the last point I make was that we should think more in terms of strategic autonomy or digital sovereignty, or people are using different terms to think more strategically about the way forward with digital infrastructures and digital means. And I think this is of course a national something that should take place on the national level, but also on the European level. For example, when you look at cloud, we have really big cloud providers, American cloud providers, and if we decide that it's important, at least for some critical processes, that they should store their data in cloud providers located in Europe, then they should have some scale. So this is, and then it's a European issue, I think. And another one is that we should think about cooperation on the terrain of European e-identity means, and the European public services. So on the level of the EU institutions themselves.
Thank you, Eric. We have another question that has to do with, should we consider that new areas are becoming critical in the cybersecurity area, such as work or education, because they're becoming so massive that they're everywhere and that they create new types of risks. So this is also very much a question about digital disruption. Now that it can happen on a large scale in those areas of work and education, should we view them as critical infrastructures too? So that is also a question to Corinne and Eric. Corinne, would you like to take it?
I think it's crucial that we think this through. Two remarks there. At least in the Netherlands, we often refer to the new normal. I don't know whether that's the case in France, but you could. I think the first point is we not only have to think about the new normal in the physical world, but also the new normal in the digital world. I mean, COVID-19 and the massive use of digital technologies, one could say it offers us a glance in the future. We currently do things that we would have done only in 10 years' time would COVID not have been here. So it offers us a glance in the future, and hopefully we can partly go back to the society we had. But what choices do we then make as regards the digital tools and the digital means that we use when we return to the new normal? What is the new normal in use of these tools, independencies, etc.? And that is the bridge to the second point. The report is not yet published, but there is in the Netherlands a report going to be published on the use and the dependencies of the universities on big players in the world. And one of the striking things there is that at certain universities in the Netherlands, there's an 80% dominance of Microsoft. So all digital tools for online education, the infrastructure type of facilities are Microsoft. From a strategic point of view, from a dependency point of view, we need to discuss, do we want to be that dependent on just one company? And so that's my answer for now, Gilles, to this.
Thank you, Corinne. We'll take a last question, which was online, which was directed to Anne, about the new norm of teleworking. Do you think this is going to be the new standard, and that it'll have repercussions in the way we not only work, but shop and teach?
Yeah. I have a personal conviction on that, but I think that we have also a very important sign that, yes, teleworking in France will really change the situation, the way of work and the way the company work. The best illustration of that is that we have a new, what we call accord national interprofessionnel. It means that social partners have discussed about that to improve and also secure the situation of teleworkers and company. For example, what as insurance are doing with teleworkers if there is an accident. So companies will really change a lot of the companies, and administration will really change a lot the way they will organize the teleworking and the remote access. And it's also something good for the some companies, because for example, what we see in startups or very innovative companies, sometimes they have difficult to recruit talents and people with very high level competence. When they said you can remote with that, you can work remote and with telework, it's much easier to recruit these talents in the company. So I think, yes, it's a very large change, a very profound change in the way we are working and in the way the companies are working. I think, and also for our territories, it's a very important impact, because if you can telework, you are not, you can live in remote areas, and for some territories, it's also a change. So I think, yes, it will have a big impact on our social organization.
Thank you, Anne. I think we will now have to move to the final part of our presentation, and we will be looking at the need for cooperation and multilateral exchange in the areas we've been addressing this morning. I would like to give the floor to Corinne for her remarks on that, and then I'll conclude our meeting so that we can wrap up at 11:30 as was scheduled. Corinne?
Thank you, Gilles. Very brief on my side. In the Netherlands, as the WRR, we presented our report to the cabinet. The cabinet is obliged by law to react. It reacted to Parliament, and at present there are discussions going on, research, also by the Cybersecurity Council in the Netherlands on what to do with, among others, our recommendations, but also recommendations from other parties. So that's the present status in the Netherlands. And what becomes clear is that on the one hand, as I said, certain actions need to be taken at the national level. We have to think about better use of incident data. I refer to that. We have to map, as Eric already indicated, we have to rethink our Dutch perspective on critical processes and critical infrastructure. So there is an agenda at a national level. But at the same time, as said, this is a cross-border development, and there are multiple players worldwide that form and create this world of which we are highly dependent. And it is my true conviction that we need to put some extra force in at a European level. As said, measures have been taken, directives has been implemented, but there's a difference between enacting it at a European level and implementing it in the different national countries on the one hand, and a true combined European effort on the other hand. Combined effort as a firefighter, in being prepared, in being prepared to help each other when fire breaks out in one of the member states, but also a combined effort in what respect do we want to be less dependent? In what respect, what does Gaia X and the developments there mean for Europe and its future? Are we able to develop an infrastructure, a cloud provision, which makes us in Europe less dependent? What is our approach towards China at a more strategic level, instead of each country doing it itself? I know, I said in the mobile world, the antennas are not in the Netherlands seen as to the core, in that the building of antennas needs to be at the European level. No, Huawei can build the antennas in the Netherlands, but it can't in France. You have more stringent provisions as regards the antennas. So at least be informed of each other, and subsequently also a step towards more cooperation, not only in ad hoc measures, but more at a strategic level. Where are we heading towards? What type of future do we want there? What type of Europe do we want there? And what does that mean for European cooperation?
Thank you, Corinne. I think it's really to the point, and among the takeaways of this morning's meeting, I would say there is an increased awareness of the discrepancy between phenomena that are taking place at a global scale, and particularly Europe-wide, and solutions where the institutions in charge are either European or national. Let's take a few examples. Trade, competition are European competences. If we want to regulate trade in areas that are highly sensitive to what we're discussing this morning, like telecom equipment, we are caught in a very difficult situation between security regulations, which will be adopted on a national scale, and a European-wide trade policy. We know that it's very difficult to reach a consensus on trade issues at a European level, because various countries will have various attitudes vis-a-vis players like Huawei, and reaching consensus is not easily done. So that we're constantly going back from the national level to the European level, and from the European level to the national level. The institutions are very clear. There are a few European competences, and then subsidiarity steps in, and you have national competences. The bulk of what has to do with security, digital disruption, security of the information systems, is national. And in the various countries, it will be handled by people who are more or less close to the Ministry of the Home Ministry or to the Defense Ministry, because there is a dimension of protecting a country against cyber attacks that can be coming from abroad. We all know that, nevertheless, the problem is global. Hackers don't have a homeland. Hackers are global, and they will be trying to hack everywhere in the world if there's a profit to be made, or if it is in line with their government-sponsored objectives, which is the case in many hacking cases. This constant interplay between the European level and the national level was already there before the crisis. But the stakes have risen enormously. And we now have to handle a situation where each country has to address new challenges on national risk assessment approaches. Just to comment on this, the OECD has been promoting since quite a number of years the national risk assessment approach. And its view is to be global, to have a common methodology for risk assessment, for mapping, for preparedness, for recovery, all the issues, or most of the issues Corinne addressed earlier. Progress has been piecemeal. Countries that looked very good as regards their institutional framework for national risk assessment have not had a decisive advantage in the handling of the present pandemic crisis. Britain was widely respected for a very wide, encompassing, and very respected national risk assessment methodology. It hasn't been of much help when the pandemic struck. So we have both something that is handled on a national level, a global challenge, and doubts on the efficiency of the methods that have been implemented for the time being. So I think one of the major takeaways for us as regards policymaking is that we are facing increased stakes, increasingly global challenges with global actors. Zoom is a global actor. Amazon is a global actor. And as you know, much of the worth of Amazon today is in AWS, which means it's cloud offering. And it's no surprise that the person who's becoming the successor to Jeff Bezos is the man who previously ran AWS. It means that it has become a completely strategic issue. Europe is not today in a position to create an alternative to Amazon, but handling that risk should be a priority at European and national level. I see that there is a hand raised by Anne. Anne, did you want to make a comment before I do the concluding remarks?
Yes, just two few comments. I think that Europe has taken the importance of the issue, because the recovery plan has a large part of money about cybersecurity, and so we can think that this is an issue on the European agenda first. And last question to Corinne and Eric. We didn't speak about the brain, because it's also, for me, the security and strategy. It's also a question of competency and how we have talent and people and engineers who are able to work on this kind of thing in the European companies. So did you speak about? Did you have any proposition in your report about that, and how we can avoid the brain leaks, European brain leaks into big and large major company outside of Europe? I think it's a very important point.
Thank you. Thank you, and that's very useful. I would suggest that Corinne or Eric make a very brief comment on that, and then we'll have to wrap up the session. But I think it's very adequate that we should be having closing remarks about skills. This has a lot to do with the problems we're facing. Corinne or Eric? Eric?
Well, very briefly, as a reaction, a report on digital disruption did not deal with this. Currently, we're working on a report on artificial intelligence and public values, and this specific point will at least be addressed there, but be addressed among many other issues. But there we will make a point. That for now, Jill.
Thank you, Corinne. I think we're ending the meeting with, I hope, a clearer view of what is at stake, of how gigantic these issues have become, of what is global, what is European, what is national, of the difficulties to find the proper level to address the policy issues. Now, of course, this is only the beginning of the work we'll all have to do in the coming years on these issues. We're very much looking forward to the publication of the report on digital disruption. That will be tremendously useful, and we'll be happy to read it. The recording of today will be available in some time, and so the discussion we've had will be accessible to those who couldn't tune in this morning. But I think we've made good way in identifying both what is at stake and the magnitude of the problems which we're now facing, as well as a few indications on where we should be looking at when we're looking for solutions. Sometimes it'll be on the national level, with still lots of progress to be done, particularly the ability of different organizations to look at problems on a broader scale than their own problems, which is one of the issues Corinne was mentioning in her initial remarks. We also know that we have to cooperate within Europe, and that this will involve a range of policies that have to do with data protection, security, trade, competition law. Competition law in the area of data is a critical issue, and it's complex, difficult. The European Commission has made tremendous progress in that area, but there's still a lot to do. And so these will be the challenges that I believe WRR and France Stratégie will be facing in their assignments in the next few years. And I'm looking forward to further occasions to cooperate with WRR on these issues. I wish you all a very good day, and thank you to our colleagues and friends at WRR for co-organizing this, and thank you for all those who prepared this morning's meeting, and to the people in the public who asked questions. I'm sorry that we couldn't take them all, but we were under time constraints, and this is the rule of such meetings. Have a good day, and I look forward to hearing from you soon. Goodbye.
Goodbye.